All right, we want to welcome you this morning
Good
to
morning.
Church Online.
Yes,
We had a great Sunday last week.
I was going to say that. We had an awesome time.
Yeah,
So
you
good to
betcha.
see you all there.
Great to see everybody, that kind of stuff. And we're going to do one again next month.
Yep.
So stay tuned. We're going to
Yes.
advertise that, so make sure you can sign up for that there. But we're glad that you tuned in, and
Yep.
we're so grateful to have this opportunity to come into your homes,
Yes.
your media devices, different things like that.
Yep.
And I had a thought. It was interesting how much things have changed since we used to have regular services, and
Yeah.
and people are getting used to being online, watching
Yes.
online, and it has its benefits. I mean, we can
Yeah.
go on, do our task, and watch and
Yes.
connect and that type of stuff. And I think that's really cool. But
Yes,
I'm
it
looking
is.
forward to when we can meet together again too.
Yes.
What-
So, yeah,
What do we want to talk about this morning?
we want to talk about life in the overwhelm.
Life in the overwhelm.
Yeah, we've been there.
I think many times
Probably.
we can relate to that about life being in the overwhelm.
Yep.
It's almost like living in overdrive,
Yeah.
or living when
Yep.
it seems to be overwhelming.
Yes.
Because we find ourselves a lot, I don't know about you, but I think we find ourselves a lot of times in situations like that. And what we want to do this morning is we want to go into 2 Chronicles
Yep.
chapter 20, because King Jehoshaphat found himself living in the overwhelm.
Yeah. And actually, it was a whole nation.
Absolutely. He was the
Yes.
king, and the nation
But-
as a whole was living in the
Yes.
overwhelm.
Yeah.
And what I want to pull out of, what I want us to pull out of this
Yes.
is the whole idea of how do we thrive, or what do we do
Yeah.
when we feel like we're in the overwhelm.
Yeah. And you know what, honey? Even in the last few weeks,
Yep.
I have felt a little bit overwhelmed with all my emotions going on inside. You know, because that's what the journey of life brings that.
Yes, it does.
Change brings that.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And I think it's important to understand that when we find ourselves there,
Yep.
because we will from time to time,
Yep.
and sometimes I think we find ourselves there a lot of the times, and we think that it's never going to be different.
Yes.
And we want to tell you that just because we experience being overwhelmed,
Yes.
that's not where our thrives from.
Yes.
That's not where our comes from. And we're going to pull out some really interesting things in King Jehoshaphat,
Yes.
and the example he was as a king to his nation, the nation of Israel.
Wow.
And we can pull a lot of things out of history, because history,
Yes.
we can read history, we can study history. And when we go to 2 Chronicles, it's Israel's history.
Yes.
And how God met the nation of Israel, and how God spoke, and how God acted, and it was always an invitation for people to be invited to join him
Yeah.
in process.
Yes.
And
In the
I
journey.
like that about the Bible and the historical accounts in the Old Testament, because we don't even see it once, but we see it all through
Yes.
how God interacted with people. And
Yeah.
I think we have to understand that that's what God desires to do,
Yes.
is interact with us
Yes. In our
as
story.
we journey through
Yes.
our stories.
Yes.
And sometimes it doesn't go the way we want it to, and sometimes we struggle with what we see and what we experience.
Yes.
But when we read historical accounts of how God met people and nations, we can learn from that as
Yes.
well, and we can navigate through and experience God in the most unlikely places or
Yes.
spaces, I was going to say.
That's right.
Because sometimes we find ourselves in spaces
Yep.
where we would rather not be. We want to be
Yep.
in a different place
Yeah.
or in a different space. And part of the life journey is learning
Yes.
to experience God in those places. And we want
Yeah.
you to be
Yeah.
encouraged as we walk through this
Yeah.
passage of
And-
Scripture
and
together.
I love that we're going to read in this story, but Jehoshaphat, because he was the leader, a lot of people looked up to him, and so
Yep.
he brought an incredible influence in walking through.
Yep.
And sometimes that's where we struggle. When we get overwhelmed, we just fall flat, we run, we crash and burn.
We mess up stuff, and
We totally, because, we get overwhelmed.
But again, that's part of life. And
Totally.
to remove those things
Yes.
would be not natural.
Yep.
And so we want to see how God fits into
Yes.
our spaces or
Yes.
places
Yes.
when life is in the overwhelm.
Yep. Overdrive.
Overrun or overdrive. So I'm going to read
Okay.
Chronicles chapter 20, and we're not going to read the whole chapter, but there's a few things that I want to highlight as you read, and then we want to dive into some of it and just see, what did God reveal to Jehoshaphat? What
Yes.
did God reveal to the nation of Israel? What did God say when they were in the overwhelm?
Yes.
What did God communicate?
Yes.
Because it's important in our journey to hear God, because we hear all kinds of voices.
Yes.
We hear all kinds of things, and sometimes we're confused. We're not sure what to do.
Yes.
When God speaks, how do we know God speaks? What does he convey, and what is he...
That is huge.
It's huge, because that's what helps us
Yep.
journey,
Yeah.
and that's what helps create our story.
Yes.
And so in 2 Chronicles 20, I'm going to start reading. It says, after this, the armies of the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Munanites, or whatever that word is, I have no
Almost
idea.
looks like Mennonites.
Almost, but
Almost. Not
declared
quite.
war on Jehoshaphat. So we
Yes.
have a series of 3 nations that are coming against Israel.
Yeah.
Messengers came and told Jehoshaphat. And then he uses the expression, a vast army from Eden is marching against you
Yep.
beyond the Dead Sea.
Yep.
And they are ready, engaged at that place I can't pronounce.
Wow.
This was another name for El Gadi. Then verse 3, it says, Jehoshaphat was terrified by the news,
Yeah.
and he turned his attention to the Lord for guidance. He also ordered everyone in Judah to begin fasting. So people from all the towns of Judah came to Jerusalem to seek the Lord's help. I want us to have a little bit of background in these 3 verses, because the situation that Jehoshaphat and Judah found themselves in
Yeah.
was incredible.
Yeah.
They were overwhelmed.
Yes. I like this version.
What does your version say?
It says a huge force.
A huge
A
force.
huge force is on its way to fight you. There's no time to waste.
And then in verse 3,
Yeah.
I'll say verse 3 again, because
Yeah.
it really emphasizes how Jehoshaphat felt.
Yeah.
Jehoshaphat was terrified by this news. And then he turned his attention to the Lord for guidance. But that wasn't enough. He wanted his nation also involved in this process. And he called them all together and asked them to begin fasting and to pray to seek the Lord's help.
I want to go back, honey, just in the face of when that bad news came. Something triggered inside of them. It says he was shaken. There was a fear that came.
Right.
They were afraid. And you know what? What happens sometimes, honey, when we feel the same thing? When we hear that report, when we hear the news, whatever comes, and we feel overwhelmed and we feel fear.
Fear is very much a part of when we're
Yep.
uncertain and is unknown.
Yes.
And it's interesting, when I look at my own life,
Yeah.
how do I deal when that happens?
Yes.
How I deal with fear
Yeah.
is directly related to what I believe
Yes.
where it's going to take me.
Yes.
And sometimes, if we're honest, our fear speaks louder and we're moved by it, so we end up making decisions that later on hurt us.
Yes.
That's what fear does. It
Yeah.
sets things in motion
Yes.
that aren't necessarily true,
Yeah.
because we see them through a certain lens.
Yeah.
But after he called the nation
Yeah.
to also stand with him
Yes.
and seek for God's help, in verse 5 it says, Jehoshaphat stood before the community of Judah and Jerusalem in front of the new courtyard in the temple of the Lord. And then it says he prayed.
Yeah.
He says, Lord God of our ancestors, you alone are the God who is in heaven. You are the ruler of the kingdoms of the earth. You are powerful and mighty. And then he says this, no one can stand against you. O our God, Did you not drive out the nations of the people around us when Israel arrived in this land? And he goes on and talks about how God rescued the nation of Israel, how God came to their aid in their difficult situation that was in front of them.
Yeah.
And then he goes into verse 12. He says, "Oh God, won't you stop them?
Yeah.
We are powerless against this mighty army that is about to attack us. We don't know what to do. But we are looking for your help."
I like what mine says, but our eyes are on you. You know what, honey? Jehoshaphat had the humility to recognize that on his own, he couldn't. And he wasn't actually afraid to say, "Well, I don't know. I don't have the answer." I think that's really important because sometimes when we're overwhelmed, it's actually hard to just admit, "I'm afraid." Let's get real.
I think
Let's get
oftentimes
real.
because of our fear, we want to overcompensate
Yeah.
and try to fix it on our own.
Yeah.
And what I like of Jehoshaphat is he recognized the situation that he found himself and his people.
Yeah.
It was beyond their ability. And the first thing that I want to point out, now we want to read a few more verses too, but the first thing I want to point out in this passage that we just read
Yeah.
is in the midst of his overwhelmedness,
Yeah.
he went to the place where he involved God.
Yes.
And I think that's important. He went to prayer. He recognized that what he was up against, he was not able to defend.
Yeah.
The circumstances were too great for him.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to highlight is the aspect of prayer in a person's life in the simplest form is we are willing to involve God
Yes.
in our process. And I think sometimes we can get skewed of what prayer is many times. And depending on our background and what we've learned and what we understand, sometimes we limit prayer to simply lists that we give God or demands that we have. But really, in its essence, prayer is inviting God into our journey.
Yes.
And that's what Jehoshaphat did.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to highlight here is, you know, our circumstances or situation when we're overwhelmed, feeling like we live in the overwhelm, God is big enough and is great enough that He wants us to involve Him in that process because God doesn't just invade our space. He wants us to have Him involved.
Yes.
And that's one of the things I seen right at the start in this prayer journey of Jehoshaphat was he recognized it was too big, too overwhelming, and he invited God in.
Yes.
And then he went as far as he called his people, the nation, to do the very same thing. And I think that is a powerful testimony when a leader recognizes he's in over his head or he's overwhelmed, but he invites others to be in part of that process as well. Let's together join and invite God to come in.
And you know what? Sometimes, honey, let's be honest here. Sometimes in our fear, we just scream out. We're like, "I need you." Like, and the prayer is birthed from fear. But you know what? God cares where we're at. He understands our emotions. He understands that is the journey of faith. Sometimes our prayers are totally emotional. God's okay with us being real in the journey.
What I like about that is you just mentioned that about being real in the journey. Jehoshaphat was real. He was the king. He could have sugarcoated it and made it not as impossible as it seemed. But he was honest and real. And I believe when we're honest and real with God, that's powerful.
Yes.
It's extremely powerful because it's honesty. And I think sometimes we struggle with honesty because honesty often shows weakness. But really, honesty shows strength. because we recognize
Yes.
our limitations.
Yeah.
Jehoshaphat recognized that, and he called the people to seek God,
Yeah.
bring God in perspective. And it's like he said in verse 12, "Oh, our God,
Yeah.
won't you stop them, because we are powerless
Yes.
against this mighty army."
Yes. And I love that he said, but our eyes are
That's exactly,
on
ends off. He
you.
says, "But we don't know what to do." He was honest.
But our
"But
eyes,
we are looking to you for help."
where's our view? What are we focused on in the overwhelm? And I wanted to say this because whether we cry out to God or not, or have him as our focus, he is involved in our overwhelm. He is already working. He is working in us, around us. But when we choose to connect with him and set our eyes on him, we become aware of his involvement.
I think it's important to us that to also recognize that it's
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
It's okay not to know.
Yeah.
He said, "We don't know what to do."
Did you hear that?
It's okay,
okay.
to not know what to do,
Yeah.
because we have God who knows exactly what to do in whatever context we find ourselves
Yes.
in, or the situation that overwhelms us. He's able
Yeah.
to give us what we need, to give us that perspective.
Yes.
And it's important that we recognize it's okay not to know. I want to ask a question here before we go further on,
Okay.
because I think it's important to tackle this. Why is prayer important? Why is it important to involve God? Because I wrote down 3 really quick things that I think it's important for us to really answer that question. You know, because sometimes we don't know, does God really care? Does he involve him? And we've said this all along, he does.
Yes.
So why is it important? And I think it's important because, first of all, and I talked about this just right now, is we need to recognize God cares. God cares when things break down. God cares when our circumstances don't come together the way we want. He cares about that stuff. That's why he wants us to involve him in our overwhelm. Because he cares. It's like, you know, parents, when their child is in a circumstance or a situation where they seem overwhelmed, we want to help because we care.
Yes.
And we care because we're invested. God cares because he's invested.
Yes.
He's invested in
He's
us.
what's invested.
It's incredible.
Yes.
So God cares. The second thing also, I think, why prayer is important is it because it reminds us of the need for relationship, and that is often where the victory is. It's in our relationship. It's in him being involved in every day. It reminds us of the need for relationship.
Yes.
We may not always have the answer,
Yes.
but it's through relationship where those answers often are developed.
Yes.
As we grow in our relationship with God and involve him in our aspect of our life, out of that relationship comes revelation, it comes understanding, comes a knowing.
Yes.
So that's a second thing why I think prayer is important.
Yeah.
But the third thing, and this is important to understand too, and we hear it from Jehoshaphat, he says this: it shows us our limits, but highlights God's unlimitedness.
Yeah.
That's why prayer is important, because first of all, he cares.
Yeah.
He cares about us.
Yeah.
And it reminds us the need for relationship.
Yeah.
We can't do it on our own.
Yeah.
That's not weakness, that's strength. Because his availability to us. But also shows us our limits, but God's unlimitedness. I think that's powerful.
Yeah, it is.
And that's what's, I think, intriguing about a relationship with God is he doesn't do this. Figure it out and I'll help you.
Yeah.
Figure it out and I'll tell you what you're doing wrong.
No.
He wants to be invited into our overwhelmness.
Yes. And you know what? He is already in the overwhelm, but we are not aware of him in there until we actually fix our eyes on him.
Right.
And be aware of the connection that we have Because
incredible.
it is incredible, because that's where we begin to get perspective in our journey when we're faced with that.
So he involves God,
Yep,
invites his nation to be involved in this.
yep,
And the neat thing is God answers. And I think sometimes, and we want to get into that here as we bring this to a close,
Yeah.
is sometimes we may have a perception
yeah,
of how God should act
yeah.
or do when
What
we
do you-
involve him.
How is he going to make this mess better? How is he going to
And sometimes we have an expectation of what we
take
want to see.
care of our battle?
And the reality is, God doesn't think like we do. He's from an infinite mind, a fully understanding perspective.
Because he sees the end of the battle.
Sees the end
He's
of the-
already seen the victory.
Absolutely.
He is
and
the
so
victory.
that's why I say it's important for us
Yes.
to understand we need to be careful that we don't have an expectation of what that ought to look like, because many times
Yeah,
what we expect
yeah,
to get
yes.
isn't the same, and so we don't recognize it.
Because I know how you would act. I know what you would want. Let's bring out the guns. Let's bring out the big machine guns now, and let's take them down.
God begins to visit with this cry and a call for prayer.
Yep.
In verse 15, he says, God speaks. He says, listen, all you people of Judah and Jerusalem. Listen, King Jehoshaphat.
Yeah,
This is what the Lord says. And the first thing he says is, do not be afraid. Then he says, do not be discouraged by this mighty army. For the battle is not yours, but God's.
yes,
He brings
Wow.
perspective.
yes,
Don't get overwhelmed.
yeah,
Don't get overrun or overcome.
yes.
Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. For the battle is not yours, but God's.
Because sometimes we think it's our battle to fight.
That's why we often engage
And
the way we
do. Yep,
And so that's what he says. The battle's not yours, but God's. And then he
Yep.
says in verse 16, tomorrow march out against them. You will find them coming up through the different territories and the avenue to the valley that opens up to the wilderness of Jerel.
you don't
These
have to say all
names,
those
like,
words.
holy my goodness, but you will not need to fight. Take your positions,
Yes,
then stand still and watch the Lord's victory. He is with you, O people of Judah and Jerusalem. And then he says a second time, don't be afraid or discouraged. Go out against them tomorrow,
Yeah.
for the Lord is with you. What a reassurance that when we're in life in the overwhelmed,
yeah,
we're not alone.
yes.
We're not alone.
And the battle isn't ours to fight. Because I feel like when we're in the overwhelm sometimes, our emotions and in that panic, we do bring out the big guns, and it's usually verbal big guns or whatever our reaction
Yes.
to what's coming against us, because we are overwhelmed and we don't have an answer and we don't know what to do. So this is essentially an incredible tool.
Yes.
Is get in the place of focusing on God. Find that
That's where our
awareness of that
bearings-
connection.
That's getting our bearings.
Get your bearings so that we understand the battle's not ours.
I want to close with this.
Okay.
Verse 21. After consulting the people, the king appointed singers to walk ahead of the army,
Wow.
singing to the Lord and praising him for his holy splendor. And this is what they sang. Give thanks to the Lord.
Yeah.
His faithful love endures forever. At that very moment, verse 22,
Yes.
they began to sing and give praise.
Yes.
The Lord caused the armies of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir to start fighting among themselves. And if I would read further, there was a bunch of chaos and mess, and they started attacking themselves. Israel never need to fight at all.
Wow. Wow.
But what's amazing is the answer that God gave them. I'm with you.
Yes.
This is how I want you to structure it.
Yes.
The power of thanksgiving
Yes.
and praise. The note I have here is this: thankfulness,
Yeah.
gratefulness paved the way
Yeah.
for their breakthrough.
Yes. Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
And I love the second phrase. His faithful love
Faithful.
endures forever.
Absolutely.
When we know that God's love is actually the greatest weapon in our battle, knowing that we're loved, it is going to break down everything that comes against us.
Absolutely.
It's powerful.
Powerful. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining us this morning. We just
Yes.
speak life over you. Have a great rest of your morning.
Have a great week.
We would love to
Yes.
look forward to seeing you next week at
Give
the
us a
same time.
message. Connect with us.
Absolutely. Like
You
us on
bet.
Facebook.
Yep.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Yes.
We would love you to connect that way.
You bet.
Thank
Okay,
you.
We'll see ya.